thanks so much for having me here. Abra's been telling me about this class, and I've been reading some of the book that you all have been looking at, and it's a really good book. I hope you all are checking it out. I read the assignments for today, so I'd kind of be up to speed with where all you are at, and a lot of the topics there really plug into what I'm going to talk about today. So I want to talk about food systems for an urban world. And, you know, I live here in the Pioneer Valley in Greenfield, which is technically called, or officially called, the city known as the town of Greenfield. And so we're kind of a city, kind of not a city. So for me, sometimes I've had a hard time connecting to some of these concepts. But if we think about the direction that the world is going, 2010 represented a really important point in human and global history in general. That was the year that human population shifted from mostly rural, farm-based type of existences to more urban-based existence. And if we think to our own country here, the United States, 2050 is the year that's projected that same shift, where you have more people living in cities than living in the country, is likely to occur. So I want to think a little bit about with you, I want to think about, you know, what is a food system and what is a city to start off. So I know you've been working in this course for the last couple of months. So let's just brainstorm together what are the components of a healthy food system, of a functioning food system. Whoa, hold on, not everybody at once.
Biodiversity.
Sure, so it maintains biodiversity. What else?
Whole cycle, the inputs go through the system as a cycle rather than throughput.
Right, right. So it's a whole system or a closed system. Recycling happens there. What else? What are the pieces of a food system? Like when you think, you know, you've been looking at this book, and what are some of the pieces? Yes, sir. Farmers. Yes, exactly. So if we think about a food system, we can think about all of its characteristics and what it does, but we can also think about the parts of it. And part of that is farms and farmers. So this is sort of the cultivation piece. Right, so we have cultivation, and then we have what happens after the food is grown. Where does it go from there? Yes, sir. Sure. So we have processing and storage. We have distribution. We also what happens after? Where does the food go after it's been distributed?
Homes, stores and homes.
Right, retail, in homes, restaurants. So, sure. So that's, I think, another important feature, and that leads to the piece that comes just before farms and farm cultivation, which is nutrient recycling. What are some things? What's some less jargony way of thinking about nutrient recycling? Waste management. What do we do with agricultural wastes or food waste? Yeah, composting. So we have these different components that make up a food system. Now let's think a little bit about a city and what the characteristics of a city are. So you've all, I assume, I'm making an assumption here. Who's not ever been to a city? Great. So we've all been to cities. When you think about a city, what are some of the physical characteristics that you think about? You know, what do you see when you're on the ground?
Concrete building.
Right. It has a lot of infrastructure. So it's built up. Sure, there's been a lot of grading. So I'm gonna put a star next to built infrastructure. It's really tightly controlled. Okay, what else? Right, we have a lot of people in on a relatively small area. Right, so within that, within that high population, you might have, different characteristics of that. So you have interesting disparate wealth distribution sometimes, and you can see in those populations that in the poor people,
A lot more segregation.
yeah, you tend to have economic segregation, racial segregation, and you have areas of affluence where people might have really high levels of health and enjoy really great services, and then you have poor areas where people might not enjoy any of those types of things. That's good. So we also have, so we have a lot of built infrastructure in cities. We have a lot of people in cities.
A lot of trash.
Yeah, and so what that generates is a lot of waste. So I'm gonna make a differentiation. When I grew up partly in Everett, Massachusetts, and we had trash cans and garbage cans, and the garbage cans were a vestigial feature from when in the 60s all the way through the 70s there were pig farmers who would come and harvest the food waste from residential areas. And so you would have this funny can in the ground kind of sunk into the asphalt with a heavy metal lid, and you'd come out and you'd dump your food waste in there, and it had a removable pail. So we're going to have lots of organic waste, which would be garbage. And then we have lots of trash. We also have lots of vehicles and other artifacts of our modern life. So I'm going to call that high culture. As someone who's based in the environmental field, we can fall into these patterns of thinking about people as bad, or only seeing the problems that arise from urbanized civilization. But there are amazing things that happen in cities, like New York, has been known for 100 years as a center of culture. Yeah, sure, yeah. So this population has a big impact in a lot of different ways. Yeah, and that might be carbon, it might be garbage and trash, it could be a lot of other things. But yeah, that's definitely part of it. So when we think about when we think about a food system and we think about a city, we see all of these different features and characteristics. We have the physical characteristics of the city. We have the processes and actions that occur in the city, like the development of culture or the emergence of new technologies that are coming from that culture. And we also have a lot of inputs coming into the city and outputs like carbon that are emerging from that city. And when we think about the characteristics of our city, and we think about a food system, we have to think about what their relationship is if we're trying to design a sustainable food system. So some of the challenges and deficits that we might have in a city if we're thinking about a food system would be what? What's one of the big things you notice about a city in terms of a food system? Or some of the positive characteristics of a food system? Yes? Sure, so there might be, low quality food, the existence of a food desert where you can't get fresh, nutritious food easily. Yeah, that's the biggest one that stands out to me when I first at the surface level look at a city and I'm thinking about, well, how are we going to feed the people in the city? There's a big gap between available land and a number of acres that are required to grow the food to feed all those people. So that's one of the key things I want to talk about next. So Richmond, Virginia is a mid-sized city on the east, on the east coast here of the United States, and it is it's an interesting place. It was the center of the slave trade, so it's built on some pretty dark history, but it's also emerged as an interesting cultural center in Virginia and has a burgeoning food culture that's coming out of it. And so they're trying to figure out how to generate and create a local food system. If we look at the size of Richmond, Virginia, the city footprint itself, the incorporated component, which is an artificial boundary, right? Because people live outside of that and they might rely on Richmond as their urban center, is 62.5 square miles. If we think about the number of people that live there, we have just over 200,000 people living in Richmond. So if we think about the way Americans eat, how many acres does it take to grow your food for a given year? Does anybody know, roughly?
For how many people?
For one person in America.
4 acres.
I hear 4 acres. I hear 1 acre.
10.
Yeah, so it can vary greatly. The UN publishes agricultural facts every year, and this year they were saying that in the United States, somebody eating the standard American diet, which is heavy on grains, heavy on dairy, heavy on meat, requires about 1.2 acres of land per person to grow food for 1 year. So if we look at what that looks like for Richmond, Virginia, here we are in the landscape with our population center in Richmond itself. You can see that circle of land grows to be much, much larger than the city of Acre itself. If the 210,000 residents of Richmond are eating a standard American diet, they're going to require 250,000 acres of land just for 1 year. That's only thinking about the people that live within the city limits proper. Never mind all these people that live in the suburbs whose land we're theoretically using to grow all the food. And if we look at the way the American diet breaks down on that same footprint, you can see that the vast majority of it is dedicated to growing feed and grazing land for animal products, so meat and dairy primarily. So in America, most of you know this from reading this book or from being in this class in other ways, that a good majority of all the cropland that's in corn and soybeans is going to animal production for concentrated feedlot operations. And I bet none of you would go to a concentrated feedlot operation and walk away feeling really good about your food source in those situations. This isn't really a tenable situation. We can't actually develop a strictly local food system for Richmond, given the land resources that surround it, because this area is rapidly suburbanizing. Much of the farmland has been now put under to homes, and the population is growing because it's a cultural center and it's attracting people from the rural areas. So how are we going to deal with this, and how do we think about this as we come to our own communities? So I want you all to break up into pairs for a few minutes and pick one of these communities. These are a few towns that are in our area, and I want you to calculate, given the variable of 1.2 acres per person per year, how much land you would require to feed the population of one of these 3 towns. That's right, there's a lot of developed land, there's a lot of mountainous terrain, there's the river and all of its floodplains, and so traditional agriculture wouldn't work in a lot of these situations. And we don't live in a totalitarian state, so we can't just say, oh, we're going to take all this land and and grow farms on it. So it's a more complex question than the one I'm asking right now. But I just wanted to give you a sense of scale as you work on that. And if we move from the city level out to the regional level, it might start making more sense. Because in the Pioneer Valley, meaning Franklin, Hampshire, and Hampden counties, roughly, the counties that border the Connecticut River, we have a population of about 700,000. And we have a land area of almost 2,000 square miles. Now that includes towns like Goshen, which are up in the hills and not very conducive to farming. But it also includes Deerfield, which has some of the best farmland in the world. So we need to be thinking about our local food systems, which might include places like our hometown, but also include the area immediately surrounding our hometown. And it's important to think about scale when you're developing that food system mind framework. So when we think about it in those terms, we know we can't have a strictly local food system with traditional agricultural practices.
And a heavy meat-based American diet.
And a heavy meat-based American diet. That's right. So right now we have a big food system, a big food footprint, and a big food shed. And when we blow this up and move out of our Happy Valley here to the megalopolis of the East Coast, you can see this becomes much more complicated. Because here we have New York City, the New York metro area, at the center of this big circle here. And depending on how you define the New York metro area, you have anywhere between 10 and 15 million people. And those people together, aggregated, have a food shed, so the area from which you're drawing your food resources of 200 square miles, or round miles, I guess, since these are circles. But then that overlaps with Philadelphia's food shed of 100 square miles, and Washington, D.C.'s, and Boston, and never mind all of the towns, including our valley, which we already can't support here. So what that tells me, as a food system planner, is we need to be more creative. We need to think about forging connections with other regional centers, so places like the Midwest or even Western New York, which has much greater land resources to grow broad-scale crops. So any of you who've had a class with me have probably heard me talk about the difference between the farm and the garden as a model. And when I talk about the farm, I'm meaning simplified systems that are providing bulk crops, our staple crops, the thing that are providing the majority of our calories. And when I talk about the garden, I'm talking about that little plot, essentially, whether that's in your backyard or your community farm or your CSA, that's providing you with high quality, nutritious fruits and vegetables for fresh eating. People understand the difference I'm making there? So we have kind of our bread and meat and cheese, oatmeal and other things that are coming from the farms, simple, relatively simple systems. And then we have the garden where you have, diversified crops where you're eating a lot of different species and eating them close to home. Now I don't want to oversimplify this because we can create robust local food systems. But what those numbers that we just explored tell us is that we can't rely just on our region. So we need to really think about some of the other important components of the food system as we're planning our strategies for creating an urban food system. And so what comes to me when I look at this is that we need to, again, make those connections with places that are further afield than our own area. And if we were to do that, which components of this food system would we have to focus on to make that food system work better for us if we're relying on regional partners or outside of our region? Like the Midwest, for instance, to grow grains and nuts and things of that nature. Andy?
Distribution especially.
Yeah. distribution, storage and processing, right? Because we need to be thinking about, the average American city has 3 days worth of food, you've all probably heard this, in its stores inside the city limits. So you have a trucker strike, you have an interruption of fuel supply, you have some other disruption. If we think about the challenges of the city, it's very easy to see the land base, and we'll continue talking about that in a minute. But some of the strengths of the city are in that built infrastructure. And that's a place where we can focus our attention as policymakers or advocates for policy change, so that we can get zoning change, so that you can do different activities in those empty buildings that are artifacts of our former industrial heritage, right? So we have all this covered space with, really good electrical service because they might have been producing paper or other products. Like we have here in Turner's Falls, you have empty mill buildings that could be converted to some component of the food system that doesn't have to do with production. It could have to do with processing and storage, and as a distribution or aggregation hub. And then we have to be thinking about how we're moving products from place to place, and making sure that those have some resilience built into them. So if there is a disruption in the in the fuel supply or something like that, or a physical event like a bridge gets cut off, that we can get food in and around those problems. So one of the things that we face on a policy level is the really good idea that came out in the early 19th century or the mid 19th century called zoning. How many of you are familiar with zoning? Yeah, exactly. So you have like an area it's zoned industrial. And in that area you can do loud things and have higher emissions coming out of your smokestacks and park big trucks in big parking lots in a different pattern than you would have in something that was zoned residential, which is the minimum lot sizes are set, maximum lot sizes are maybe set depending on the zone. And in the 19th century in New York City, there was a big mix of different uses that were going on. There were slaughterhouses next to tenements, next to factories, right on the shore or next to waterways. And so you had mixed waste coming into waterways, polluting it. And you had people living in close proximity to dangerous chemicals and biological hazard like, waste from a poorly managed slaughterhouse. And so there were good reasons that we came up with both environmental regulations and zoning. But as we move into this new era where we're trying to integrate food system planning into our communities, we have some vestigial policies that we have to deal with. In Greenfield, for instance, anywhere within the city limits, there's a maximum of 9 chickens that you can keep and no roosters, right? So that makes sense if you live on Davis Street in Greenfield and you might have neighbors on all sides and you don't want to have large quantities of chicken manure building up, and you're always planning for like the worst case scenario for the worst chicken farmer around. But it might not make sense for someone that lives out on Coleraine Road that has 3 acres of land, or someone up in the north part of town that might have 15 acres of land. So we need zoning and policy changes to happen that make sense to support these local food systems, especially in our urban situations, whether that's Greenfield or Brooklyn. So if we go back to this image here that we were looking at before, we can see that we have our big food shed of Richmond, the 250,000 acres. But if we zoom in to just the garden produce, the fruits and vegetables that are hardest to ship and be really high quality, and some meat production, some fruit and nut production, some staple production, we can see that actually is only about 3.5% of the total cropland required for the food shed of Richmond. So that's about 8,750 acres. So if we have 8,750 acres that we're trying to fit in the city to grow our fruits and vegetables, that's still a little tight. That's probably a lot of the open lots. But that's, again, assuming a standard American diet and poor cultivation practices. If we look at some of the more intensified cultivation practices where we're getting more yield per acre, then we can reduce that footprint substantially. Ecology Action, who knows the Ecology Action Center in California? It is the originator of the grow biointensive method. John Jevons wrote a book called How to Grow More Vegetables Than You Ever Thought Possible on Less Land Than You Could Imagine. It's just called How to Grow More Vegetables, typically. And it's a great guide for growing vegetables in an intensive way. And so they claim that you can grow a complete diet, vegetarian diet, on 1/10 of an acre instead of 1.2 acres. I don't totally buy that number. I think that's really, they're in Davis, California. It's really nice down there. They don't have winter, really. But that suggests that we might be able to do some things to reduce that big footprint down to a smaller footprint. So there's some different ways that we can do that. And one of these ways is through the intensification of our cropping practices and thinking about ways to get multiple yields from those cropping practices besides produce that address some of the problems of our urban environments. So Growing Power is this pretty cool project that was started by this fellow here, Will Allen, a former professional football player from Milwaukee, who, after he retired, wanted to come back to his community where he'd grown up. But he found that the community was in pretty rough shape because of deindustrialization, the shipping out of jobs away. There was a lot of poverty and a lot of challenge. And so he looked around, and one of the things that he saw lacking was high quality food and good jobs for people, and just general self-esteem and community pride. So I don't remember when they started, but it was quite a number of years ago. And today, Growing Power, which started in Milwaukee, is now in 2 additional cities, Madison, Wisconsin, and Chicago. And they're growing over 200 products on over 300 acres of land that are small community, they're dispersed little farms throughout these different cities that are managed and run by some staff and lots of volunteers and some cool programs that involve youth. But what all of these farms depend on is an intensified model where you're using vertical space and the built infrastructure which cities are rich in to grow high quality food for people. So at Growing Power, this is just a diagram that my colleague Helena Farrell put together. They're using this stacked function of what's called aquaponics, where basically we start with fish. We have fish that are growing in these water tanks that are being aerated inside greenhouses, and they are eating and they're growing, and they can become a yield themselves to produce high quality protein. But they're also pooping a lot in this water and producing fertilizer, which is then filtered through these these beds, which may be more like hydroponics, where they're growing primarily in water, or they might be soil-based systems that are being fertilized by them. And they're taking advantage of all the vertical space by building infrastructure and growing on multiple levels. And that nutrient is being cycled like you would in a natural ecosystem from the water. The yield of that part of the system from the fish is serving the need of the plants because they're getting really high yields from these greenhouses. They need a lot of fertilizer. This is some images of this system. You have Will Allen here pulling out some of that tilapia and perch. Yeah, sir. Right, because you're losing a lot through evapotranspiration to the atmosphere. They have different ways of doing it. They might be just refilling the water tanks from city water or wells. In some cases, they're doing rainwater harvest to refresh that water. Just some pictures of this system. So you can see that it's really heavy on infrastructure. But a lot of this infrastructure is being recycled. They're taking down other buildings that were abandoned and taking those building materials and putting them into these structures for growing plants, where they're growing, microgreens for urban school systems. These are usually the kind of foods you'd find on plates in fancy locavore restaurants, but they're making their way to foods to schools in the city. And part of this waste is being recycled. Their extra cuttings, their rotten vegetables are being recycled by these worms, these red wigglers, which then become food for the perch and the chickens that they're also growing in these systems. And that's another thing that they're doing here at Growing Power. They're recycling the organic waste of the neighborhoods and the farms, the schools that they're serving, and recycling them into fertilizer, which they can then sell as a product too. And they also have other animals there. So this composting system is integrated with their animal system. So they're getting that high quality food waste from schools. They can feed that to chickens. The bedding that the chickens are living on, they can then scrape up and put into the compost pile for other waste that they're capturing, to create a system that produces these really high quality greens using solar power and providing a lot of educational opportunities for people throughout the community and abroad. People travel from all over the country. Growing Power has become a real model, and it not only grows produce, but it also grows community. They have this Youth Corps program that's a year-round program that trains local kids how to grow these crops. And not all these kids are going to become farmers, but we've seen in another farm in our area, Nuestras Raíces, which is in Holyoke, that even though these kids might go on to, study law or something else, the experience of working with the land and working and having people depend on them is transformational. And in our cities where you really struggle with equity in education and access to economic resources, that kind of self-confidence boost can be transformative. So one of the things that I would ask you about is, what are the barriers to replicating programs like Growing Power at the policy level, at the personal level, and at the infrastructure level in your city or in our region? So that's just something to think about. And as we answer these questions and we can multiply these, we can take these disparate community farms like we have in Richmond. So I found that there were 12 community farms in Richmond. Some of them didn't even know about each other. And we can take them from being these disparate nodes of activity and transform them into an interconnected web where they're learning from each other and helping the city grow as a whole and increase the resilience of that local food system and working together. Like, some of these plots were really sunny and some of them were really shady. So they could be growing different products and aggregating their products together and having a more diversified CSA within that city, rather than the folks over at St. Catherine's Garden mostly getting, annual vegetables, and the Tri-School Gardens, which is on this mailbox here. It's not just a mailbox. It was very shady, and so they could be growing a lot of shade-loving crops together. So one of the other things that you read about was humanure and waste in general coming out of cities. And there are millions and millions of tons every year of organic waste coming out of our cities. And we need to come up with more robust ways to transform that back into fertilizer for our farms. Because right now, a lot of it is getting incinerated or just getting landfilled. And that's taking a resource and turning it into pollution. So we want to do the opposite of that. Growing Power has a great practice of transforming that. And you can see here, they divert 6 million pounds of waste every year that they turn into compost for running their operation and then sell to other farms and community gardens in the area. That, as they say, turns the problem into solution. And one of the big problems that this also helps address is climate change. Because I don't know if you read much of chapter 5, but you'll see that the majority of organic waste is organic because it's carbon. It's a carbon-based molecule. So if that organic matter got created by plants pulling carbon dioxide out of the air and into their bodies, if we can hold that in the soil, then we can actually address some of the increasing carbon levels through regenerative farming practices. And we can also think about our human manure, our human waste, as a resource too. It contains all of the minerals and nutrients that our crops require to thrive. However, they are right now being addressed by these super infrastructure heavy systems that require lots of electricity to run and are often located in the floodplain of whatever local river, meaning that they're an ecological catastrophe just waiting to happen every time the floodwaters come up. And so instead of having systems like this or the much groovier looking system of one of New York's wastewater treatment plants, we could have integrated systems that turn our human waste into a resource. So one of the ways that we can do that is by connecting that system more to itself. So right now, if we're thinking about what a healthy food system does, it's a cycle, right? But in America, we have cultivation and we lose some of that food just through rot and waste that happens as food's moving from cultivation and processing and storage. We lose some of it from that same method in distribution. I'm sure you've all heard this, but we lose 40% of all the food that is grown by the time it gets to our kitchens and our restaurants. So imagine almost half of the farmland that's required to keep America going could be returned to natural ecosystem processes or Native American tribes from which it was taken many years ago, or any other creative use besides growing corn and soybeans for cattle to be killed and then have their meat rot in your refrigerator, right? So that's a big deal. That's a big deal. So we need to make sure all of these processes are working better so that this is not happening. And in America, the big loss, one of the other big losses is here, nutrient management. We're losing so much resource in the form of nutrients to landfills, the ocean, and other places as we lose both soil and food that gets diverted from the cycle and is incinerated or whatnot. So we need to eliminate these throughput type thinking systems for something that works more like this. So one of the ways that we could deal with human waste, instead of dumping it into the local river after spending lots and lots of carbon to process it with electricity, is use it to actually generate electricity through anaerobic digestion. Yeah, so basically you poop in a can that doesn't have oxygen in it, has a little bit of water, and the anaerobic bacteria that live in there create methane. I don't know if any of you ever had a septic system backup and you smell that horrible smell. Well, you can do that on purpose and in a controlled way and capture that anaerobic digestion and burn that in power plants to generate electricity, or better yet, in a combined power facility that's generating heat and electricity close to the end use point. So you could have, theoretically, instead of having the sewage treatment plants in New York City, you could have several of these anaerobic digesters processing all that waste and plugging that electricity back into the grid right there. So your transmission losses are less. And then one of the other great benefits that comes from this is the organic compost that can be recycled back into our farm systems and used to transform abandoned parking lots into raised bed gardens. So there are some really scary things that can happen if you concentrate waste and don't treat it correctly. However, there are some really great advantages. So part of it is just policy catching up with technology. Some of it is in the harder thing to change. Before you can change policy, you need to address people's internalized models of the world and address the fear that they might have about these different systems. There are a number of these already just in the valley, and Greenfield is actually doing a viability study right now. The results might actually be in on whether or not it would make sense to build a municipal scale biodigester to generate power in Greenfield. Right, so that's one of the important points that was pointed out in chapter 5 of this book, was the idea of eco-san. So right now we have sewers that combined industrial waste, waste from the hospital, with our poop and pee. And so we're creating a kind of volatile soup that makes it harder to reclaim the nutrients because there's a bigger chemical load. So one of the ways you can deal with that is by separating those things out. And that's been done in really sophisticated places, technologically sophisticated places like Norway, and very poor places like India. And the methodology might look different, but the effect is the same. And it's meaning that you're spending less money on treating that industrial waste appropriately, and you're gaining the benefit of treating that organic waste as a resource. The big question you're asking is, what about these new problems that we have from GMOs and synthetic hormones and medications? And that's something that I don't have an answer to. I've been looking into it. Some of those things break down when they go through the digestion process, and some of them don't. So I think this is a bigger systemic problem that we all have to be thinking about and I don't know, struggling with. And we've separated ourselves out from the natural processes of the world. And so we need to figure out a way to get ourselves back in, right? We need to be less afraid of ourselves if we're going to solve some of these big problems and address the food system and other big systems that are not working so well. And one of the ways that we can do that is by transitioning the way we grow food to be more like a forest in the city. So how do we do that? And how do we use these resources of the city to grow food in a way that doesn't freak people out? And one of the patterns that we can use is the edible forest garden. Now, this isn't going to feed, the masses, but this is going to get people in the dirt with their hands, picking things off of trees and engaging with fresh fruits and vegetables, engaging with trees and shrubs and plants, which we know has a huge therapeutic impact and will just be good in helping people understand the processes that are involved in the food system. I remember when I was 23, I had a friend, I was working on a farm, and she came to visit me, and she was looking at tomatoes, and she was looking at the flowers on the tomato plant. She was 25, looking at flowers on the tomato plant, looking at the tomatoes and saying, do the flowers become tomatoes? Like, she had never made that connection before. She grew up in Maine for 25 years and had never made that connection. So even if we are just inviting people to grow food in a way that is more like the garden, that's just supplemental to the food system, it can have a big effect because it can help people transition their perspectives. So, one of the things that we can do is use these forest-like food systems to cycle those nutrients that we were talking about. So if we go into a forest and we think about what's happening there, what makes the forest good in terms of an ecosystem? Like, what's happening in there that is beneficial that has the whole environmental movement excited about trees. Yeah, so you have soil that's filtering out wastes. Yeah, you're cycling nutrients. Somebody else? That's right. So you have an interconnection between the different species that thrive in these ecosystems. Right. So you don't need inputs. You don't need to like go fertilize the forest most of the time or like weed the forest. And you have a diversity of plants and animals living there, which is important. Why? Because when things change, if we want a resilient ecology, let's say there's a big storm or it's a really cold winter or a really hot summer, if you have a monocrop, like that big field we saw in that first picture, it might all die in that condition. But if we have biodiversity, some of the stuff is going to survive. And so that niche has more chance of being filled. And so when we look at a forest, we have multiple layers. We have canopy, understory, herbaceous stories, and all of it is cycling nutrients with the air and the soil to get from the beneficial qualities of the agricultural system that you can see has, whoops, I'm missing some things here, high levels of productivity, but a lot of low levels of the beneficial things we want to see and require a lot of inputs, whereas the natural system tends to have low fragility, so it's very resilient, and it's got a lot of diversity and a lot of connection that you all identified, and it requires very little input, but its food production capacity is really low. So one of the ways that we can move from forest to farm or come together is by having these designed ecosystems that model the structure, use vertical space like we did in the built environment, but in a way that is growing food for people. I think a lot of you have probably heard of edible forest gardens, which use, and there's a whole course unto itself, which create polycultures, multiple species living in one place to provide specific yields, using a lot of species that we might find in our forests, like walnuts, and adding other things like the pawpaw to create these productive communities that get people really excited. Like, these aren't going to feed your belly for the whole winter, but they're going to get you excited, and you can see you can integrate these into an urban setting. So you're going to get people outside, and one of the best things about these types of systems is that because they're perennial, they don't require as much input, and most of their structures are above the ground. And you can apply things like human manure-derived compost to systems like this and freak people out a lot less, because their plant parts that they're eating are nowhere near the root zone where you applied that material. And people recognize some of these. And you can integrate them into stormwater systems in cities, so you're doing multiple functions in that case. You're dealing with some of the runoff from our cities and turning it into productive space that feeds people and gets people excited. So we have examples of this in multiple cities throughout the country. The Beacon Food Forest is one that's out in Seattle, Washington. I've been working on one at Wellesley College for the last bunch of years, where we've been creating multiple habitats on this site in the historic campus to create a really beautiful location where people can come and see beneficial insects thriving in this designed ecology to produce a lot of food. Well, to produce some food for people, and also opportunities to work and learn, to transform this site, which was a big grassy field, using simple techniques into these productive ecologies. This is the first season after planting. This is the second season. You can see the plant communities evolving. And one of the other big yields from this is knowledge and engagement in the landscape. So here's a clump of chives and a red currant hiding amongst them. And you can see this big tag, and there's a QR code on here. So one of the things that we've done is label all of the trees and shrubs in the garden in their different patches with lots of measurables. With these QR codes, it allows you to go to this site, scan that QR code, and then enter data into application on your smartphone about what you're observing to capture citizen science-based observations. So it's pretty exciting. So you're getting people thinking, you're getting people eating, you're getting people learning, and increasing the literacy about not just plants, but about the food system as a whole and the natural system that that food system depends on. So, some of those key strategies for dealing with production in our urban food system are intensification and the use of non-traditional agricultural techniques in public spaces like these parks or on campuses. So UMass has a forest garden where it's gotten thousands of students involved, both at the college level and engaged kids from local school systems who have gotten to explore the different ways of growing food. One of the other things that we have in all of our cities are waterways and roadways that have different characteristics and could be developed in different ways to create a productive conservation. So using that forest structure again to grow food and herbs and other important crops for people. This is a picture of a nut farm in Appalachia that also grows golden seal and ginseng. Ginseng in 2009 was going for $900 a dry pound. So you're encouraging people to keep this structure of forest along waterways that's producing some food and some medicine and addressing other urban problems of pollution and impacted waterways and making more connectivity for wildlife. So you're interconnecting the food system with the ecosystem and the human health and cultural systems and getting all these benefits and all these yields. This has been done right here in Massachusetts at Fresh Pond in Cambridge. This is one of their drinking water reservoirs. And the area was restored, and many of the species that were used to transform this old construction materials dump into a wetland are edible. And it's become a really big place of learning. So you can enhance the network of gardens and farms in your city with a network of productive conservation systems along the waterways and other critical ecosystems in your city. So, but there's a lot of policy barriers to implementing these things and a lot of internalized, paradigms that we're thinking incorrectly about is this trash or is this a resource? So that is my time.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you. Change the world.